Okay. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. As I was just sharing with the team, it's 4 a.m. So if things start going a bit weird, please let me know. And then if I start mumbling, please let me know, and then I'll get back onto track. All right. So I'm gonna discuss some of our work trying to push robots towards environments where they can interact with people. So I'm interested in this area, primarily due to the fact that robots are moving out of these constrained, single, very structured environments like factories into environments where where people are around and which are unstructured or semi-structured. For example, when I was a PhD student, I worked on smart wheelchairs for children with disabilities, helping them get around safely. So this is me, climbing into my smart wheelchair, right? And these wheelchairs are meant to help children get around in safe way, where environments where there are people kind of moving about, their caregivers, the occupational therapists, other children. And the robot has to kind of take these into consideration when trying to avoid collisions and keep them safe. So today, my group looks at a variety of tasks. I am particularly interested in tasks where there's close proximity between the robot and the human being. So, I ask questions like, can a robot help human beings, help us with PCR tests, for example? And I think everyone here today is familiar with PCR tests, right? Something quite unpleasant. And the question is, would you trust a robot to kind of help you in this kind of task? And I think right now, I would not necessarily trust a robot to let me to kind of perform this procedure on me. I think for robots to help us in these kind of tasks, we require, we really need to give them a set of physical skills. And this involves things like tactile perception, grasping, safe control, but also social skills. So if you think back to the time that you went for a PCR test, I don't know, but when I went, the doctor who was performing this procedure on me didn't just, kind of shove something up my nose. That's a really strange interaction. They are usually trying to calm you down. They kind of build trust through communication, put you at ease, and then that enables the procedure to go ahead much more fluently. So I think if we want robots to help us in this kind of settings, we would need to give robots both physical and social skills. Now, these kind of skills are useful for a variety of tasks, involving close proximity between human beings and robots. So for example, we want a robot to help us clean a wound, or with assistive feeding, these kind of skills also come into play. So typically, we think about how the robot interacts in the world using this kind of autonomy stack. So we have a robot, interacting with the environment, with people, and it goes through this sensing, perception, planning, control, actuation, takes an action, the world changes, and then it goes through this loop, right? So about 5 days ago, I was presenting kind of this at IROS and thinking about how we can change this autonomy. Sorry, not at IROS, at a Neurix workshop. Like I said, it's 4 a.m. So at a Neurix workshop, and talking about how we can change parts of this stack and present some of our work across the different layers. Now, this is where this talk today is going to fork. All right, I'm not going to give a high-level talk per se and just kind of quickly go through the different vertical layers. Rather, I would I think although we do some kind of nice work looking at sensing with tactile perception and kind of inserting human models, I want to focus in on one particular component, which is the model. Okay, in particular, I'll talk about deep latent state space models, which is kind of my favorite go-to model nowadays. And I'm going to talk about work that we have done with regards to deep latent state space models, because I think that these models form very useful components, a useful component for robotics moving forward. So today's talk will kind of be in 3 parts, more or less. The first will be preliminaries. So you'll have a tutorial-like flavor at the beginning. I hope to bring everyone kind of up to speed with respect to latent state space models. So I don't know whether everyone on the call today is familiar with the latent state space models. And if you are, then this will be kind of like revision, and maybe you can take a nap for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. But if you're not familiar with it, then I hope that to give you some extra knowledge, a new tool, a new modeling framework that you can use for your particular problems. And then we'll move over to more researchy stuff, talking about some of our work in multimodal perception and later into assistive communication. And these two works use latent state space models by leveraging the structure within them or learning particular aspects of them. So this is work done, of course, by my students and my research staff, and in particular, Kai-Chi, who is standing over here. I'll show you another picture later on, which is a bit clearer. But also, I would like to acknowledge all their fantastic work and also say thank you to my collaborators as well as my funding agencies. So let's start off with our preliminaries. Okay, so I'm going to introduce a latent state space model. Okay, so it looks like this on the right. Okay, and so what is the structure? So essentially, it's a PGM, a probabilistic graphical model. So it's I wish I was there in person. Then I can ask do you guys know this already? And then maybe we can through something. But okay, I'll just go through it. And if anything's unclear, please just ask. So this is a probabilistic graphical model. Each one of these circles contains it basically represents a random variable. Okay, so your z's, your x's, your r's, these are all random variables. And the nodes which are shaded, right, represents random variables that you can observe, okay, in the world. And the ones that are unshaded, like the z's here, these are latent or hidden, or things you don't see. So let's give these names so that it's a little bit easier for us to talk about them. So the z's are what we call the state, all right, and these are again hidden or latent, right? We don't see them at a particular time step t minus 1. Let's say we start there. This can generate the latent state generates an observation. This you do observe, okay, and you can emit other things such as rewards. So this can be useful for doing tasks like reinforcement learning tasks. We're trying to maximize the cumulative rewards as you execute the policy. At each time step, you would execute an action, or the robot executes action, and then the world transitions over to the next state. All right. Now, what I'm showing on the screen here illustrates the structure of our model, but it's incomplete. You would need to parameterize the structure using conditional probability distributions, typically, and prior distributions. So the most important ones, of course, are our transitions. All right. What is the distribution of the next state given the current state and the action which was taken? You have observation distribution. So what is the thing that you observe? Probability distribution associated with the thing you observe given the state. And of course, and if you're doing an RL, of course, you represent the distribution of the rewards given the state as well. All right. Now, typically, we would parameterize these functions. So these distributions, for example, zt plus 1. So the next state is some function parameterized by theta of the current state and the action you have taken, maybe plus some noise. Okay, and where epsilon can be drawn, let's say, from a normal distribution. If the function f theta is linear, let's say. Okay, and if all the functions are if it's linear, then and on the observation distribution is linear as well, with Gaussian noise, and your priors are Gaussian, then you get back this linear Gaussian model, which I think most people are familiar with, and you've seen them in the guise of, let's say, a Kalman filter. Of course, nowadays it's common to represent these. To get more expressive models, you can use neural networks to parameterize your conditional distributions. Okay, so for the transitions, it's common to use a multi-layer perceptron, for example. For your observation distributions, if you are dealing with images, then it's very common to use convolutional neural nets, for example, in order to generate a particular image from your latent code, right? From the state, you would like to generate a particular image, all right? Now, once you start using these more complicated distributions, then, inference then becomes difficult for you. Okay, you need to, when you're dealing with, let's say, a Kalman filter, everything's very neat. It's very elegant and everything's tractable, so that's very lovely. But once you start introducing these kind of deep neural networks, then inference becomes a bit more hairy. Nevertheless, the nice thing about PGMs is that compared to kind of doing just a standard deep neural network where you just train things end to end, is that you have this structure. And the nice thing that you can do is leverage the conditional independence assertions within this structure. So, for example, in this for this structure, we can say the joint, the probability distribution of the joint xt and rt, the observation and rewards, given the state, can be factorized into two distributions, right? The probability of the observation given the state and the probability of the reward given the state. And the reason why you can do this is because of the structure inherent in the model. So this is a tent structure, and then you can't information can't flow once this is observed. Okay. So we often leverage these kind of conditional independence assertions when we are doing our derivations in order to make things tractable. So this helps us a lot during inference to keep things clean and nice. Now, even though you can leverage kind of these conditional independence assertions, inference, as I mentioned before, is harder when you have these kind of deep neural network parameterizations. So you're going to have to leverage more complex inference, usually variational inference, and that's a common thing that we do nowadays. So we introduce variational distributions in order to do learning. Now, I'm going to kind of walk you through how we can learn the parameters associated with this model. So typically what you do is you collect lots of data, right, consisting of trajectories in the environment, and then you try to learn this kind of model. And we learn the model typically using maximum likelihood estimation, so MLE, where we try to maximize the log evidence, right? We try to maximize the probability of the observations that you see. Now, trying to optimize this is typically intractable, all right, due to the fact that we're kind of parameterizing these models with deep neural networks. So we're going to have to do variation inference. I'm going to kind of, if you've never seen this before, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the math. It's not hard, right? But if you've never seen it before, it's kind of useful for you to kind of just see that it's kind of straightforward. All right, we'll focus in on just this part. Okay, this part of the structure, just to keep things easy for us for this talk, but you can kind of extend the technique to the rest of the structure as well. Okay, so let's start off by looking at the log evidence. And the problem is that why this is intractable is because you have to do this integral, right? You have to marginalize out your latent variable. In this case, is z, and when p theta is this parameter of the complex neural network, then you really can't do this integral in closed form. All right, you can't do it analytically. So what can you do? So we first apply Jensen's inequality. So we put the log into the integral, and then this is a lower bound on this quantity. And then we do something a bit weird. We introduce this q here. All right, this is the variational distribution, and because this is just q, this is equal to 1. Right? It's QZ over QZ, so that doesn't really change the quantity, so that's 1. But what this allows me to do now is to look at this as an expectation. But the expectation is no longer over PZ, but is over QZ. All right. So now I have I've written this quantity as an expectation over QZ. I can apply properties associated with logs and kind of split them apart. Okay, and eventually you arrive at this form, right? Where it comprises, the lower bound comprises two terms. You have your likelihood here under the variational distribution, and a KL divergence between the variational distribution and the prior. Okay, so this is very intuitive, right? It's really nice. It's saying, look, I want to maximize the probability of observing the data under the variational distribution, and I want the variational distribution to be as close as possible to my prior. Okay, so that's the interpretation of it. Now you can extend this kind of derivation to the entire structure over here, okay, and you will get this kind of low bound where you have your observation reconstruction term, you have your reward reconstruction term, And you also have a term relevant to the dynamics, okay? So to allow you to learn the dynamics associated with these transitions. And by maximizing this lower bound, then you're able to learn the parameters associated with this model. I should point out that even though I've written like QZT here, everything, just remember that it's conditioned upon XT, all right? Or sometimes we even use the history of X's. All right, so what's the benefit? Now I've walked you through kind of the structure and how we can learn these models. What's the benefits? So out of the box, you get uncertainties. So unlike, some of these deep neural networks that you train, those didn't give you uncertainties. Uncertainties are very important, for example, for safety, whereby you're trying to kind of minimize risk or keep risk controlled in some way. You can leverage structure. As I mentioned before, you have this conditional independence assertions that you can make, and then use them in order to simplify your lower bound. So simplify your derivations. In this case, we use them when we are computing, for example, this structure where we can decompose the joint into individual terms here. So you can see that it's just written in terms of expectations over these different random variables. And we can do that because we have leveraged conditional independence. And these models can be very expressive because, we are leveraging, we can parameterize them using very flexible functions, neural networks, for example, or you can use other functions as well. But yeah, they can allow you to express a complicated transition as well as complicated distribution functions. So these kind of models have been used in various settings. If you want to see how they can be used for learning and control, you can look at a very nice tutorial by Sergey Levine. You can find this on Archive. You can also see more recent works making use of variants of these kind of state space models. For example, to master Atari games using 2 hours of training in order to get human or surpass human level performance. And this is very recent work called Efficient Zero. And if you're interested, you have the tools kind of to understand that paper in a fairly good way now that you know about state space models. Okay, so now we have the preliminaries out of the way. I hope that everyone's kind of on track, and we can talk about some of the research that we've been doing in order to use these models for robotics. And I want to talk about how we can extend the model I described before towards learning world models from multiple sensors. And in our case, we're looking at sensors that are possibly unreliable, or we don't sample them at, they don't give you data at a fixed sampling rate. So the impetus for this was because we were looking at these event-based tactile sensors, whereby they don't give you data all the time. They capture differences in pressure. And when there's appreciable change, then this results in a signal. Okay, like it's essentially a spike, right? It tells you, okay, the thing has changed, and then they don't tell you anything for a while because nothing has changed, and then something has changed again, and then the sensor will tell you something has changed. So this is a very different sensor from standard cameras where you get information at a fixed frame rate. Now, I would like to kind of combine these sensors with like standard cameras and then use them in a coherent framework. So we looked at again our deep latent state space model, all right, and this is a familiar structure now, and we extended in a very simple way. We said, okay, you know what? You don't need to just generate one kind of observation. You can generate a bunch of observations, all right? And each one of these corresponds to a different modality. So this can be your camera, this can be your tactile sensor, okay? And we've kind of put them all in this very nice structure. You can train this structure in a very similar way. So again, we apply our elbow derivation technique that you now know about, and leverage conditional independence. You can see that you have terms, one term for each of these different modalities. So you're constructing reconstructing these different modalities as you try to train a model. You also have the term for the rewards and the dynamics as before. The variational distribution that we're going to use, the Q here, is what we call the product of experts fusion. Okay, this is a very standard approach. Okay, in the literature, it was proposed by Hinton back in 2002. And this form here, it's very nice because very often what we do is these Qs is that they are normal distributions. And the product of a normal normal PDFs gives you another PDF, which is normal up to some proportional factor. And so this is very easy to do, okay, and it's tractable. So this fusion step is neat. Okay, now if you try to do this, unfortunately, it does not work. Okay, this is what we discovered. We applied this. We thought, everything's beautiful, let's just try it out. And this fails, okay, to learn a good model. And I'll kind of walk you through it with an example. What's going wrong, okay? So we imagine if you have a robot, okay, which is like a vacuum cleaner operating the world, and the whole world is just like this 2D plane, okay? And the robot is moving around and it has two kinds of sensors, all right? First, it has this range sensor, okay, it gives you like the positions from the two walls, okay? So it is basically its XY coordinate. It also has a ceiling camera, which we can access, okay, to give you like a vision of the world, okay, an image telling it where it is in this world. Now, if you try to train a model as I've described, using the approach I've described, you don't really get what you want. And the reason is that the latent state space that you get from the model, basically how the Z's are structured, right, the space of the Z's, is not coherent. If you project, the observations into the space, what you would like is that for the XY coordinates that you get from the position sensor to be consistent with the state that you get from the camera image, all right? But that's not what you see here. The position, each of these dots represents a state in the world, okay? And this is disconnected from this camera states, right? However, when you fuse them together, then you see that, oh, the fuse model just looks exactly like the position states. And what's going on here is that the model has become over-reliant on the position sensor. It's saying, look, I'm just going to kind of do what the position sensor says. I'm just going to kind of ignore the camera sensor. So how does this work? What is going on here? And so I'm going to kind of explain to you using an illustration. This is cartoon illustration, but just to give you an idea of why this isn't working as we hope. So the position sensor is, kind of projecting to some point in this latent space. So this is the space of our Z's, okay? And so it's giving you a Gaussian in this space. All right. So remember the distribution, the variational distributions Q, output Gaussians. And your image sensor, so ideally, this is what we want, is for it to kind of project to somewhere which is close by. And then when we fuse them together, we get a new point, right? This is after fusion. And once you fuse them together, you can reconstruct your position as well as your image, right? This is what we would like. And if we drop one of the sensors, let's say we drop this one, you can just use your position sensor in order to still reconstruct, for example, your image. You can still reconstruct your image and position, if you only had one of these ones, if you only had the position sensor, let's say, because they project it coherently to the same point in the space. Now, what's going on in our particular model is that, okay, the position sensor is giving you some point in the space, okay, a Gaussian here. The image sensor is giving you some different point in the space, far away, with a large variance, all right? And when you try to fuse them together, what happens is the POE, because you're using a product Gaussians, it tends just to focus on, it gives you a point somewhere around here, maybe, all right? It tends to overemphasize one of the sensors that doesn't have this, which has a smaller variance, much smaller variance. And so what's a problem is that if you lose this sensor, when you try to reconstruct from this point here, that can give you very bad results, right? So we don't like this. This is what's happening right now. What we would like to do is maybe get to a point where we can constrain the model somehow so that we get back what we want, right? We project to this point in the space, we project, hopefully, somewhere close by. And if we do this initially, we fuse to this point, and we would like to constrain these distances, maybe, to be close together, all right? So that's the key idea that we want to do. We want to constrain the distances in this latent space when we project into it and have them to be close to one another, all right? So that even if we lose one of our sensors, it doesn't matter. We can always reconstruct from either sensor in using the latent code that we obtain in this space. So here's the idea, okay? We want to constrain these different modality projections into this space to be close to one another. And so when you fuse them, you get something that's coherent and the space is nice, all right? And we're going to do that using this sort of functions that this is what this function says, essentially. I want the latent code. Oops, sorry, that's not quite right. All right, I want the latent code for this modality. That's sorry, give me get back. That's not disappearing. Don't know why. Okay, never mind. So there's latent code here that I'm getting from my modality. This is the fused latent code, and really I'm trying to constrain them to be close to one another. All right, so that's what I want to try to do. But our current formulation, all right, the elbow that we were discussing before, the lower bound that I'm using to train the model, doesn't really afford me the opportunity to insert this anywhere. Okay, so we had to change the lower bound in some way, and we showed in the paper how you can this lower bound is actually equivalent to another one, which no longer has this reconstruction term. Instead, it has a mutual information term, okay, plus some constant value that you can drop out. All right. So this mutual information term, all right, is what we are going to optimize instead. So you don't have to reconstruct anymore. You just have to maximize the mutual information between the axis, these observations, as well as these V's. These V's are, you can think of it as the information coming from the other modalities, as well as the latent state. So the way we train the model is using the info-NCE loss. This is noise contrastive estimation loss. We didn't invent this. Okay, this comes from an earlier work, but it's a very nice form. You might have heard of it. It's using contrastive learning. So in this particular setup, you no longer do reconstruction. What you do is you try to optimize what we call a pre-task. And in this pre-task, you set the model up so that it can learn to distinguish positive from negative samples. And here the positive samples, this pre-task, you define what the positive and negative samples are. In our case, the positive samples are those coming from the observations that come from the relevant Z's. And these are observations for a particular modality M that come from just randomly sampled from subproposal distribution. So what's going on is that the model is learning to distinguish the Z's coming from the relevant latent states. And this enables it to push it closer together. This kind of info-NCE loss affords us a design flexibility. We are able to decide on this function FM, which is the density ratio estimator. All right, if you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. Essentially, it's a function that we have kind of freedom to design. And here is where we can plug in the functional form, which I described earlier, which tries to push these latent codes closer together. All right. So now we have our technique. Okay, we are just going to optimize the elbow, but now using this information term compared to standard reconstruction. And I've kind of glossed over some details. There are some additional things that you have to do. For example, decomposing the latent state into kind of deterministic and stochastic components, but I'll leave that for you to read in the paper. It's not that complex. It's just a little bit additional complication in order to get the system to work. Okay, so once you train the model in this way, then you will get a nice coherent representation across the different kind of across the sensors, as well as when you fuse them. And we call this approach MUMMI, or multiple modality mutual information based kind of training for deep latent state-based models. All right, let's move on to some experiments. So in our experiments, we use natural Mujoko tasks. So these are like your Mujoko tasks I think most people are familiar with. This is Walker, for example, where you're trying to get this bipedal agent to walk or run or stand. We made it more complicated. So now it's not shown here in this slide, but I'll show you in the next one. The backgrounds here have inserted in as distractors. So there's a video playing in the background. And the model now has to kind of recognize this agent from the video. It can leverage its depth modality, which is cleaner, right? Cuts away the background noise. And we use a tactile modality as well. So you can think of these as pressure sensors on the feet of this bipedal agent, right? We tried out with other two domains: finger spin, whereby this robot finger is trying to spin this, I don't know what you call it, spinner as quickly as possible. And a cup catch, where it's this old game where you try to get this ball into this cup by swinging it up and catching it. All right. Again, for these two tasks as well, there's distractor videos playing in the background, and we have tactile modalities. For example, on the fingertip, we have a tactile sensor here, and on the cup catch, we have a tactile sensor in the cup. So this is an example of our of our model working in action. Right? It's learning to basically spin this thing as quickly as possible, and it's able to do it in fairly a few number of iterations compared to prior work at that time. Okay, so it's kind of using these different modalities. It's the tactile sensor, so the depth sensor in the video, all together in order to get this kind of performance. So we compared our model against an ablation. What these different kind of different variants or models, how they're different is you have MUMMY, which is our approach, MUMMY B, which is ablation, where we got rid of the, it uses a different kind of function F, when I described before. It doesn't really constrain the model to have codes which are consistent with one another. All right, it encourages the learning of dynamics instead. CVRL essentially does constructive learning, but without the multiple modalities. So what we do there is that we just concatenate the different observations together and treat it like one single modality. And then we can use the standard kind of model where you don't break the observations apart. And Dreamer is a state-of-the-art model for model-based reinforcement learning. And you can see that where it uses a single observation, right, and reconstruction loss in order to do this. So CVRL uses a constructive loss, Dreamer uses a reconstruction loss. And you see our model is able to achieve, higher rewards in general over time, but it also learns faster. I think because it's able to leverage different modalities in a better way compared to the other approaches. We also tried this on a robot arm in simulation. So this is a cleaning task, okay, where the robot is trying to clean basically this spill on the table. And you can see that even if we remove one of the sensors, and you can remove any one of the sensors shown here, the robots can still perform the task in a reliable way because it has this coherent representation that you can use in a world model that it can use to operate more robustly in this world. Okay, so that's how we can extend, this basic vanilla state space model, which I described in the preliminaries, to something which can incorporate multiple, kind of noisy sensors within a coherent framework. Here we have leveraged the redundancy within the sensors, but you could also kind of structure the model in order to leverage complementary information, and that's something we're trying to extend the model to do. We're also interested in long horizon tasks. So the kind of the setups that we're looking at is pretty short horizon kind of tasks, like spinning the wheel or kind of walking. These are kind of dense reward, relatively dense reward, short horizon tasks. I think hierarchy will come into play when you're talking about long horizon tasks. And there's some recent work looking into these kind of world models for long horizon tasks. You can think of it as having two layers, if you want, whereby you have your faster time scale at the lower level and a slower time scale at the higher level. I think these kind of latent state models also can be used for I showed kind of experiments in simulation. We have some experiments in real world as well, but kind of getting them into a good enough state, I think it's something we're working on. I think safety is something that these latent state models can provide, because they provide uncertainties as well as a description of the world, which you can then leverage in order to make your systems perform more robustly. And finally, I would like to use these models for human-robot interaction. In fact, that's what I'm going to discuss next in the next kind of part of the work, whereby we use these models for communication. All right. So let me see whether I can get rid of this there we go. That's better. Okay. Oh, no, it's still there. All right. I'm trying to get rid of this.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
So for the first part of your work, in the sense of the lane space, are you able to use the L2 distance between different modalities because your lane space is over like some physical like 2D space, like rather than some abstract lane space? Is that why you're able to?
Yeah, so for the kind of toy task that we presented with this model with the vacuum cleaner, yes, that's a 2D space, so we can use the L2 distance in the latent state space. But that is not the case for the other experiments that we try, right? For the spinner and for the walker, and those are high dimensional state spaces. So we're not using L2 in those kind of coordinate spaces per se. We're constructing a new latent space whereby the L2 distance is over some projection of these latent variables. So there is, I didn't specify, I kind of skipped over this or glossed over it, but really you use some sort of projections into you're using neural networks into the projected space where you can enforce these L2 distances.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the second thing is I saw you, so I think Geoffrey Hinton had just talked about his like forward algorithm with using like kind of a contrastive learning method with like positive data and negative data. I saw like you had mentioned some positive and negative things. Is that kind of similar in that idea, or?
So I haven't seen Hinton's recent talk, but this contrastive learning thing is fairly popular, and people have used it to great effect in different kinds of areas. The key takeaway here is that don't do reconstruction unless you have to, because if you think about it, the reconstruction task it's much more difficult, especially when you have a lot of distractors in the background, which are completely irrelevant to the task at hand. So there you're trying to reconstruct the kind of movie playing in the background in addition to the agent moving in the foreground. And this is really, why do you need to do this to complete a walking task? What you like to do is actually ignore the background and focus on the agent itself. And this is what this kind of contrastive methods allow you to do, because here with this pre-task, you're just trying to distinguish between positive and negative samples is to some degree much easier than trying to reconstruct the task at hand, and still gives you the information necessary in order to construct latent codes that are useful for constructing your world model.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, so let me move on to the next part, which is about using kind of these latent state-space models for assistive communication. So here we would like the robot to provide useful information to a human being, all right? And again, we're going to leverage these latent state-space models, but in a kind of, I think, quite interesting way. And Kai-Chi did this very nicely with Geoffrey. So I'm going to set this up with a very, with a kind of simple toy example, all right, just to get the message across, and then we kind of look at the technical details a little bit later. So here we have a robot and a human being in a room together, and there's a box in the room, and what the human being wants to do, let's call him Harold, okay, wants to get to the exit, all right? But we switch off the lights, and so the human being isn't aware of a box in the middle of the room. Okay, and if if he just carries on, there's a chance that he's going to collide with the box. So we would like the robot, in order to tell the human being that there's a box in the room, to help them to complete their task appropriately. So this is really easy for people, right? Because we have a theory of mind. Okay, we can imagine what it's like to be the other person, and so we can construct appropriate or helpful communication that way. But the robot doesn't have that, so we're going to have to build that in some way. What we're going to do is let the robot kind of forward simulate different trajectories that the human being can take. And then, by observing these trajectories, what the robot learns is that, hey, if I don't tell the human being anything, then, they're going to crash into the box, and that's not good. So we would like the robot to kind of figure out that, hey, if I tell the person, hey, there's a box there, then they find their way to the exit safely. So the way we do this is, again, to leverage our latent state-space model. Okay, we have a robot model that we assume that the robot has learned using, say, a combination of RL or some other technique. So you have your ZTs, which is the robot's current, belief of the state of the world, and that emanates a particular observation, ZXT. We feed this into the human model. Okay, the human model outputs a particular action AT, and then we feed that into the dynamics, and then we can roll this out into the future. Okay, this is how we are generating these trajectories that are executed by the person. Now, what we can do then is to plan by changing these axes. All right, by optimizing these axes, you can think of it as optimizing the observations that the person or simulated person makes. And then by doing so, you can change their behavior. All right. So for example, if I tell the person something, it's as if I'm changing their observation of the world. Okay. I tell them there's a box there. It's as if they know that the box is there. That's a kind of observation, and then they'll change their beliefs and hopefully change their action. Now, a big question, of course, is what do you use for the human model? There are different kind of techniques you can try. General trends is to handcraft it. Okay, you can do that using like a cognitive model sort of architecture, SAW or ACTAR. This can be quite popular and also very effective, but you have to spend the time to handcraft it, and that's not easy. We tried to do kind of a lazy person's approach, all right, whereby we copied over essentially the robot model onto the human model. Okay, and this kind of approach is inspired by human beings. So I've not met any of you in person before. I don't know you, but I can still reason about what you're doing and whether you're understanding what I'm saying or not. Right. And the way I'm doing that is to put myself into your shoes. This idea of social projection is heuristic, basically, that human beings use to create effect. And by using this kind of human model, what we can do is very nicely kind of put in all the observations and generate the actions, as I've kind of alluded to before, using our state space models. However, if you kind of do this naively, this is not going to fly. All right. And the reason is that if the robot thinks that the human being is exactly like it, there's nothing to communicate. Because the human being knows exactly everything that the robot does. So this is kind of doing this is a pointless exercise. So the robot, you can't just get away with just copying stuff over blindly. You got to be a little bit more clever. So we need to somehow account for the differences between the human being and the robot. All right, that's the key idea. I use the robot as a reference point, but then I want to learn the differences. So to learn the differences in general is kind of tricky. Do I have to learn the entire model from scratch? We say no. We think it's better to leverage the structure within these models in order to learn what we call implants. All right. So, for example, perceptual implants sit between the observation and the latent state, in order to basically capture how differently the human being perceives the world relative to the robot. Okay. So these can be very small functions that you can learn with much less data compared to learning the whole model from scratch. You can also have policy implants that sit between the the beliefs as well as an action. Okay, the latency as well as the action, and these can give you how the human being behaves differently relative to the robot. Okay, and again, this can be a relatively small function, like a single layer neural network or 2-layer neural network, something simple like that. Finally, we can remember I talked about multimodal. We can put that back into our structure. Okay, so I described it in terms of single modalities just to keep things simple. But in our particular paper, we've extended to multiple modalities. And the reason why you can do this now is since the robot can sense multiple modalities, we assume the human being can as well. And this allows us different communication channels in order to communicate with the person, in order to give them information. So instead of kind of telling the person verbally, if kind of showing the person is more efficient, then the robot can choose to do so. So this is the structure of the model. That was a very high level view of how things are operating within our model. This is a more precise diagram. Okay, and you can look at kind of the details in the paper. Right, I'll just give you the brief highlights. You have 3 major parts. You have the robot self model, the human model, which is the self model with implants. Okay, and you have this policy implants, for example, perceptual implants. These are small functions that sit in. We have leveraged the structure to put them in very strategic places in order to model these differences. And then we have constructed this communication pathway to link these 2 models together. Okay, and this communication pathway, what you're trying to do is really just optimize these communication variables in order to change the observations into something that the model can observe. So the robot self model is what we've seen before at the beginning part of our talk, right? We've talked about kind of how to extend state space models in order to do these kinds of handle the different kind of modalities. And we also get the inference networks that enables us to do inference in a quick manner. This is approximate inference, of course. And then the human model leverages these inference networks, at the same time inserts these implants in order to capture differences. In our setup, we use very simple perceptual implants like this perceptual implant here, where we just try to capture how far the human being can see, which may be different from the robot. Okay. In the case where we switch off the lights, then the human basically doesn't see anything, and so the filter basically goes down to 0, and saying that the human being doesn't observe the world, at least from a visual modality. And then when we're doing the communication, what we're doing is we're trying to optimize the task rewards. Okay, in this case, we assume that the human being and the robot are sharing the overall goal, right? So that's the same goal. So the rewards are the same. And we try to minimize communication costs associated with this task. And so we've tried it on different kind of domains. All right, I won't go into detail due to time. I'll just mention that we first tried it with simulated human agents. So why we use simulated human agents is because it's easy for us to kind of with human agents, I can't really change them using code, but with simulated agents, I can go in and do all kinds of unethical things that you can do with simulated agents by changing their behavior and kind of viewing what their reward functions are and knowing the ground truth. And I don't know that with actual human beings. So we tried it out with simulated agents first on 3 different domains: grid world driving domain, where this blue car is trying to avoid the collisions with these red vehicles in a foggy environment, and I'm trying to give the robot is basically trying to give the human being hints about the world, right? Communication actions in order to avoid these collisions. And these kind of communication can take the place of kind of visually showing you the other cars in the environment or telling you about cars in the environment. There's a search and rescue task where this robot is trying to this human being is this blue dot here is in this world trying to get to this victim, this green dot here, and kind of getting out. Okay. And in a smoke-filled environment, what information can the robot give and when in order to help the human being to complete the task. And finally, there's this bomb diffuser game that we're playing around with in order to help the human being basically defuse a bomb. So in all these settings, what we find is that our model is able to provide useful communication using very little data compared to current methods. So for example, compared to behavioral cloning approaches, which is kind of a supervised learning technique, standard supervised learning, and Squill is a imitation learning technique that is able to access the environment. It's kind of like Gale, all right? And compared to these methods, you can see our models are able to achieve far, on the metrics we care about, like number of collisions in the grid world, you can achieve much better performance compared to the other methods using very little data. Okay, and I think that 0.2 here, I think if I remember correctly, is like 4 trajectories of some human data that you observe. Okay, this data is basically used to learn the implants in the world. And likewise for the search and rescue and the bomb diffuser task. Okay, for the search and rescue, we got some mixed results in the terms of the number of steps required for the human being to complete the task compared to the other models. And the reason for that is actually that our model is providing much less communication. So you can see that the visual and verbal communication that our model provides, here shown in orange and blue, is far less than the other models. So the other models, what they're doing is they're cheating. They're kind of showing the human being everything about the world. So they're able to complete the task, yes, but at a great communication expense. Okay, let me kind of briefly talk about the human subject experiments because this is a little bit more fun, where we get people into the lab and interacting with our communication agent. They're driving, okay, and they're driving in this foggy domain here. These 2 pictures compare the same scene in clear weather as well as in foggy weather. So in clear weather, you can see these 2 cars very clearly in front of you. But in the foggy scene, you can see this car at the side, but the forward car is clearly not visible at all. Okay, and what we like the agent to do is to help the human being drive in this kind of setting. So the human being is tasked to, at a particular starting point to drive to a finish line, and there are other cars in the environment. Okay, so this is a behavioral cloning setup where we're using a behavioral cloning agent in order to provide the communication. And here you can see that the communication was provided a bit too late, and the human being had to do a really fast swerve in order to avoid a collision. This is a variant of our model where we use belief matching. So in the setup I talked about earlier, we are doing planning. So we are trying to minimize communication costs while telling you what is necessary for you to complete the task. Another approach is to say, hey, you know what? Maybe I don't need to do all that. What I want to do is just tell you what you need. You just try. I believe something, you believe something. I'll just try to line them up. All right. And if I line them up properly, you know everything that I do, and you should be able to complete the task. Okay. But what this approach does, unfortunately, no car detected at your right rear. I don't know whether you can hear detected at your left rear. What the model is doing. But it's being extremely annoying. It's basically telling me everything. No car detected at your left rear. This is a dynamic environment. No car detected at your left rear. And so since it
No car detected at your left front.
can't really keep track
car
of what
detected
you
at
know
your
and what you don't know, it's telling
No
you
car
everything
detected at your right front.
so it's
Car is
extremely
approaching fast
annoying
in your right rear.
as
No
a
car detected at your left rear.
agent. So this is our approach. As you can see, it kind of tells you what you need to know at the early stage, and then allows you to kind of nicely avoid collisions and helps you get to the finish line. So we can see that our approach, when tested with real human beings, actually results in a remarkable decrease in performance, decrease in the number of collisions, so better performance objectively. And you can actually inspect the implants that you have learned. So here we see some of the implants that we have constructed from exercise, and we can see the model actually learn something which is reasonable, that the human being can see stuff at the side here, but not in front, right? This is what these things are telling you. The range of what human being can see are shown by these lines over here, and the human being can't see stuff in front of it. Subjectively, we see that our approach also surpasses that of the behavioral cloning approach. So it's considered by human beings to be more helpful and timely, as well as kind of picking the right modality for communication and action, and resulting in higher trust in the model overall. And compared, of course, to the kind of belief matching agent, our approach, the planning-based approach, is much less. It provides much less redundant information. So the nice thing about getting people into the lab and kind of interacting with us is that they can tell us things which you can't get from just simulated human agents, right? They tell us qualitatively how they felt about the different models. So about the behavioral cloning approach, they basically didn't like that. Okay, no one said that they liked this model. But interestingly, some people liked the talkative belief matching agent, right? They said that we had this interesting comment from a participant who said they felt annoyed and safe at the same time. And this particular person liked this belief matching agent much more than the planning agent. And we asked them, why is that? Isn't it annoying for you that they keeps talking all the time? And he says, yeah, I did feel annoyed, but the other agent, well, it was a bit too quiet. Right. His quote was, I have some confidence that it works, but I'm not entirely sure because it is quieter. So what's going on here is that there are some unmodeled components that we're not accounting for in our mirror framework, right? Components such as the person's emotions, right? Affective state, as well as their trust in the model. So what's going on is that right in the beginning, the person may not trust that the assistive agent is operating as it should. And so they don't know whether the system is being quiet because there's nothing to tell them about, or that there's nothing there. Okay, so what we should try to do is really incorporate some of these human elements back into the model, and that's what we're doing now. We're trying to incorporate some elements of trust into it. So you can imagine that what will happen if you incorporate trust updates is that initially the model thinks, okay, I don't know if this human being believes what I'm saying or not, so I'm going to give it some information so that it can confirm that I'm working. And then beyond that point, start to decrease the information that it provides. So this is a quick summary of the stuff I talked about today. I talked about these latent stasis models and how you can train them to have coherent representations when you're dealing with multiple modalities, and all kind of using or the same structure for doing assistive communication with agents. So I didn't talk, as I said before, I spent a lot of time talking about these latent state space models and how you can use them for fun and profit. But they are to achieve really trustworthy robots, I think we're gonna have to work across the stack. I just think that these models represent a very important component that hopefully now you can use for your own applications as well. For details, you can kind of ask me questions now, or we can do hit to the website or send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should open the floor to questions. Anybody vote, please type in the chat or unmute yourself and ask the questions. And when boom, should feel free to just call.
So I'll ask a question. So with your second part of the talk, what would you do if the robot was also blind in the environment?
That's a great question. So in this work, we assume that the robot kind of is MDP, right? The robot knows the state is fully observable to the robot. Currently, Kaichi is working on that question that you have just asked. So he's considering situations where the robot has only partial information about the world, and the human being has partial information. And this information may, they might know the same things, but they also might have complementary knowledge. So the robot knows something that human being doesn't, and human being knows something that robot doesn't. And this really is the setup that we are most interested in, because this is where communication really plays a major role. Right. So you can also account for this using state space models. Okay. The way we're doing this, decomposing the latent state into different parts, representing knowledge things that you know and things that you don't know. And this is basically the gist of how we are approaching the problem. And you can train it using clever techniques as well. But I think you got to wait for another, hopefully 6 months or so. And then I'll kind of share the paper with you down the road.
Awesome. Yeah.
I have a question also.
With
the additional work on mummy, it seems like it requires that the different modalities during training time come in at every time step, or you have like synchronized data from the different modalities of sensors during training. Is there a good way around that limitation to make it so if you have sensors that have different frame rates or whatever, you can easily exploit that?
Yeah. So actually, our model doesn't require the sensors to come in at a fixed frame rate. In fact, the reason why we constructed these was to be able to handle missing data, right? And that's really nicely handled within our state space model. You can just drop within the fusion step, you can just drop the modalities that are not present at the time. So that's one of the key benefits of the model. Sorry, I didn't emphasize this earlier. I think I skipped over it when I was talking. But yes, you do not have to have the modalities come in at a fixed frame rate or have the modalities present at all time steps. In fact, that's one of the key benefits of the model.
Okay. Yeah, I noticed that you did need during testing, but I missed that you did need during training also.
Sorry, I missed that question.
I just said that I noticed that you did need them at the same frame rates during testing, but I missed that you could also handle it being unsynchronized during training.
Yes, so we have different frame rates during training and also during testing, actually. And during our testing, we actually had different setups whereby we dropped different amounts of data. And you can see the performance degrades. Of course, if you drop a lot of data, I think beyond 50%, you start seeing quite significant degradation. But still, the model is still able to perform in those setups much better than the baselines. But yes, this is exactly the regime that we're interested in, where there are sensor drops.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just had a last comment. It reminds me of like, when you have a reverse beeper, like when you're driving a car and you're reversing and then it's just constantly beeping at you. But like, it is kind of nice when you know like it's beeping. That means you're still far away, or like you have some space. But
yeah, exactly. So I guess if I could replace the beeper and I knew like kind of and I trusted it, then I would only kind of want it to come on when I was getting too close, or you notice that I'm really reversing at a far too great speed, in which it would cause a collision in the near future. Then I would like it to start beeping loudly in my ear, right? Actually, on my car, we disabled the rear beeper thing because it was, my wife found it really, really annoying, and so she requested for the Volkswagen to kind of take it away, and so we don't have it anymore.
Exactly. I guess then it matters about the human who's using the robot, I guess, at that point, what their preference.
Yeah, that's right.
Very cool. Great.
Okay, we are after 4 o'clock, so we should let Harold finally go to sleep. Let's thank you for this wonderful talk, and yeah, we look forward to seeing your work in the future.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for allowing me to share my work today. It was great.